Good morning. I'm John Coombs of Hampden-Sydney College, and welcome to this session on studying slavery in the information age. For kind of launching things off, I thought a good place to start is to introduce my fellow panelists for this session. David Eltis, who is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of History at Emory University. Fraser D. Neiman, Director of Archaeology, Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, and a fantastic person. Jillian Galle, Project Manager, Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, or DAACS, which we'll be hearing about during this session, also at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello. And finally, Scott Nesbit, Associate Director, Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. Now, as a point of departure, when Laura and I and Elizabeth and Justin were kind of conceiving this symposium, the vision that we had in mind was kind of tracing the process through which telling the history of slavery begins and ends. So from the start with research all the way through interpretation, presentation to the public, and ultimately its consumption. And of course, as a process, that begins with in the archives or in the heat and dust of a summer field season in the case of archaeology. And so in terms of kind of describing my own work, I mean, I thought I would go first, in part because the database I've assembled is the most parochial and in many respects the most old-fashioned. And it essentially is a collection of databases that I compiled in the process of stripping the records of Virginia from between 1630 and 1730 in support of a book project that I've been doing. Now, that's not a particularly innovative thing to do, and I had many influences in kind of conceiving the research dimensions of my project, most notably the work of Russell Menard in his article, The Maryland Slave Population, 1658 to 1730, a demographic profile of blacks in 4 counties. As I was looking over Russ's article last night, he, in the introduction, was saying that probate inventories are an essential source for understanding the development of slavery, particularly in the Chesapeake. And at that point, in 1975, they had scarcely been tapped. So this was a brand new sort of approach, and essential because, unlike the other inhabitants, the white inhabitants of early America, and particularly the elite, not many slaves left behind accounts of their lives. There are no account books or correspondence or anything like that. And what we basically have are these scattered materials, oftentimes evidence created in spite of itself, or with no intention of becoming evidence that to work with. And so historians very quickly, particularly during the advances in scholarship associated with the new social history, began recognizing the value of this kind of quantitative evidence for the study of slavery. Russ wasn't alone. I mean, another partner of his in what would become the Chesapeake School, or what many people know as the Chesapeake School, others, including their friends, sometimes refer to them as the Maryland Mafia, was Alan Kulikoff, who did very similar research on a slightly later period that underpinned his article on the origins of African-American society in Tidewater, Maryland, and Virginia, 1700 to 1790, that was published in the William Mary Quarterly 3 years after Russ's article. Then, of course, there was Darrett Anita Ruttman's study of Middlesex County, A Place and Time, that came out in 1984, which used very similar methods, focusing on Virginia, of course. And then finally, the final influence I would point to is Philip Morgan and his tremendous study, Slave Counterpoint, Black Culture in the 18th Century Chesapeake and Low Country, which was published in 1998. Now, one of the things that kind of struck me as I was thinking about this approach to the study of slavery that is so integral to my own work is the growing scale of analysis. So when Russ was working in in 1972, 75, that time frame. He assembled a data set of roughly 2,400 inventories drawn from the 4 counties on the western shore, lower western shore of Maryland that he was studying. Dared Anita Ruttman, as part of the process of stripping the records of Middlesex County for their period, their study, which extends from 1650 to 1750. Part of that research was a data set of 400 inventories, of course focused just on the single county that they were analyzing. And then Alan Kulikoff put together an unspecified number of inventories drawn from Menard's Maryland study, and that's kind of one of the hallmarks of this, is it's cumulative, people drawing on other people's data, either in raw form or in some cases what they can cull from the publications associated with it. And to this, Alan added additional data drawn from the records of Prince George's County and St. Mary's County, Maryland, and additional inventories from York and Lancaster counties in Virginia. So a little bit larger data set, and with Alan's work, we start to get a comparative dimension now across 2 different colonies. And then finally arrive at Phil Morgan, who, working more or less around the same time or in the immediate period just after this. And to underpin his study, Phil, again, kind of compiled a data set. I can't tell you the number. Phil probably could. We all seem to know this. But they combine the data sets assembled by Menard and the Ruttmans, information compiled by Michael Nichols on 7 counties in the Virginia Piedmont for the period 1737 to 1775, and probate data he assembled himself from 10 additional Virginia counties in all South Carolina inventories for the period 1700 to 1779, to which I say, now we're talking, right? Well done, Phil. So we have kind of an escalating scale of information, increasingly, and by Phil, we're really getting to the point where we can do comparative analysis of different areas and over larger expanses of time. And so as I said about my own research project, it's kind of a combination of all these. It's not just, I didn't assemble just a data set of probate information, all that's the largest component of it, but what I did is essentially strip all of the extant Virginia records for the period of my study, which is 1630 to 1730, and from that put together several data sets, a series of data sets that collectively kind of capture all of the available information in those local records for the period. The major data set consists of data derived from a total of some 8,300 inventories and 11,200 wills, all broken down into various variables, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But in addition to this, several smaller data sets drawn from deeds and order books that survive that capture information on the transfer of slaves through sales to other individuals or gift, certificates awarded for taking up runaway slaves, age judgments of children brought before the county courts, prosecutions of interracial sexual pairing and the birth of bastards, manumissions, and free people of color. So it's a massive amount, well, at least for a single study on a single colony, of information that's available. Now, it's not just the building of these data sets, but also the questions that we ask of them. But before getting into that, I just want to remark that all of this has been made possible by the advances in information technology, computers, and so forth that we live in today. I mean, in the course of my research, working at the Virginia Historical Society, I went through the records deposited there from the Ruttman's research on Middlesex County. And it's amazing to me. I mean, the assembling of even 4,000 inventories in what truly was the dawn of the information age was just an extraordinary undertaking. For the Ruttmans, this meant compiling individual sheets on every individual named in the Middlesex court records and writing that down by hand on sheets of paper. And these are all stored in a collection of binders that are on deposit with the Virginia Historical Society. But then they transferred that information, or what information they wanted, onto punch cards that then had to be fed into computers using software that was largely done for scientific study or accounting in order to generate their kind of findings. We no longer have to do that, thank goodness, because of advances in software. I personally work with the software package for the social sciences, or SPSS. This has become a much more streamlined process, and so you can compile and accumulate much larger data sets than probably would have even been feasible back in the 1970s, and particularly working as a single individual in the archives. It was also facilitated by a wonderful invention known as the microfilm scanner. So as part of my research, I spent some time at Colonial Williamsburg and the Virginia State Library, and was able to take the microfilms that are available of all these county court records, scan them, and turn them into PDFs, so I can go back to the information, so you don't have to transcribe everything. You can just cite it, put a PDF page number, and boom, you can go right to the record. And this enables us to do social, apply the techniques of social history on a much larger scale, and ask new questions. Some of those questions that I brought to bear on the data are traditional ones. So, for instance, Russell Menard and Allen and the Ruttmans, and to some extent even Phil, I mean, they asked some of the most basic questions to try and get a handle on this subject. The age structure of the slave population, changes in sex ratios over time, reproductive rates, labor force size, right? These are kind of core questions, foundational questions that any scholar interested in the study of slavery would ask. But as scholarship has this propensity to do, earlier work informs later work, and I can benefit from questions that their own studies raised and apply them to this data set that I acquired. I mean, I'm very sad that Jennifer Morgan isn't here, because she's part of this. One of the whole reason I studied wills, or I actually started to put will data in just in support of the probate information, the inventory information, but after reading her book, had to go back and revisit about 5,000 wills just to capture some of the information that she highlighted is important in certain kinds of questions. So some of the new things I'm able to do with my data is partly a reflection of the benefits of a comprehensive approach by doing all the inventories in all these counties for the study period. I mean, one of the reasons that I decided to do that is I came to the determination that history has already selected the sample. Right, that the loss of records due to court fires, the disruptions of war, has already limited the material that we have to work with. So I'm going to look at everything that's available and try and squeeze as much out of it as I can. But other questions emerge just through the course of reading and dealing with the information. One is to examine the social distribution of slaves, that is according to strata. So looking at making sure I'm keeping track of who is an office holder, a member of the gentry, and who is not, as simple as that. Another one that kind of emerged from the work of Lorena Walsh in her landmark article on subregional differences in the Chesapeake economy was thinking in terms of geographic distribution, right? So that, in other words, the character of slavery and the economic system that it underpinned was different depending upon the type of tobacco that's grown. On some areas of the Chesapeake that didn't even grow tobacco, there's a different labor regime that one needs to be considered. So kind of tracking these not only on a county by county basis, but also looking at broader subregions and thinking about differences in the character of slavery that account for them. Another one is Indian slaves. That none of this previous work really captured the presence of enslaved Native Americans on plantations, and this is one of the most gratifying findings. Not the existence of Native American slavery, but rather the benefits of a comprehensive approach. In that, if I had just sampled certain counties, like Allen had done, York and Lancaster, Native American slavery is not a factor almost at all in those counties. But It is a tremendous factor, particularly in the decades surrounding the turn of the 18th century in the upper James counties of Charles City and Henrico. And I would have missed that entire moment had I not done that. Another is tracking mulattoes, both slaves and servants. A lot of this earlier work didn't differentiate between whether a slave was classified by their owner as a Negro or as a mulatto. So keeping track of that enabled me to ask and answer questions about the process of interracial sexual pairing, incidents of that, and ultimately mixing, right, of races. To use I realize it's a social cultural construct, but nonetheless an important consideration in the study of this. Also, the distribution of slaves on different quarters, and particularly this turned out to be a very important issue because the period I'm studying marks the conversion from white servitude to black slavery in the Chesapeake, and thinking about how the allocation of laborers in different areas on a plantation provided opportunities for maximizing exploitation, which is a subject that Lorena Walsh and I are going to publish an article on fairly soon. Finally, family relationships among slaves, as well as data on the ages, more refined data on the ages of slaves, the age structure of enslaved labor forces, which, expanding upon the pioneering work that the Ruttmans did with this, now I have a data set in which to kind of make those assessments on a colony-wide basis, and the presence of skilled slaves. Working with the wills, and particularly thinking again in terms of questions that you can ask and answer using this data, and here I was very informed, as I said, by the work of Jennifer Morgan. I wanted to look at inheritance patterns, to what extent slaves were allocated from the person who had acquired them to their heirs. And this is an important question for capturing the two sides of the story of slavery. We can study it from the vantage point of the master, but also from the enslaved. In this case, the passing down of wealth from one generation to another, the transfer and the status and opportunities that wealth provided in this society, but as well as kind of the impact of that on family formation, on family cohesiveness, reproductive potential, and so forth. Wills are also a crucial source of information for the frequency of manumissions over time. And so thinking about it both in the 17th century up until 1691, and then after that year, which is a law was passed requiring that any manumitted slave leave the colony. So kind of looking at changes over time and the different measures that masters, in some cases, masters took to accommodate manumitting their slaves to conform with the law and so forth, other questions like that. And then finally, mulattoes as a percentage of the population, people of rich racial descent, mixed racial descent. Oftentimes inventories being taken by people who are not part of the family, really no reason for them to identify people that had a mixed racial background, and they often appear just as Negroes in the inventories. But in wills, and in many cases, planters went so far as to allocate all of their slaves to different eras. They're much more inclined to identify a certain slave as mulattoes and so forth. And kind of by comparing and contrasting those two separate, in some ways complementary data sets, we get a clearer idea of these kinds of that issue. The last thing I would say is that I think it would be of great benefit moving forward, and I was chatting with Scott Nesbit about this earlier, is the next step, I think, in the evolution of this, and I think computer technology and the World Wide Web will greatly facilitate it, is taking this kind of information, which is now confined in a spreadsheet, and putting it on the landscape, right, and mapping it over, because this is the one crucial element that inventories don't really allow us to address, and that is space. Much of that earlier work in the 1970s and even the 1980s emphasized the isolation of slaves, the size of individual holdings, the number of slaves who might live in groups of 1 or 2 or 10 and more. But we have to remember that these slaves don't live in a data sheet. They live in a real spatial setting. And so knowing that a planter who might only have 1 or 2 slaves physically live next to a planter that might have 50 slaves, you get a better sense of community, the opportunities for family formation. Issues like abroad marriages and so forth is such a critical component of the story of slavery. So on that note, I will pass off to my fellow participants on the panel.
Well, my name is David Eltis. I'm actually emeritus now at Emory since I accepted the invitation. The status has changed. Yes, my name is David Eltis. I just wanted to indicate that, in fact, since I accepted the invitation, my status has changed to emeritus. It is a great pleasure to be here after a gap of 12 years, and especially at such a well-organized and well-attended conference. My own contribution here is largely in terms of the phase of slavery before the phase that John's been talking about. I've been associated with a group which has put together two data sets, both of which are available on the web. Some of you may know this one. It's the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It's the first of the two sites that I want to draw your attention to is showing right here. It's the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, and as you can see, it has information on 35,000 separate slaving voyages, and it has three major components. You can search the 35,000 voyages. Here's the first 10 of them. Or you can go to what we call the estimates page, which shows you what we think is the size of the slave trade. And you can arrange the data in any sequence of time and space that you like. And then the third major component, which is currently under review, is the African names database. At the present time, this page transfers you to the second of the two sites, which I want to speak about briefly right now. This one is the African Origins Project, whereas the first site that I've just shown you focuses on voyages. The Origins Project focuses on the people who are on those voyages. And it comprises, at the present time, 91,491 individuals who were removed from the slave ships as they crossed the Atlantic during the abolitionist era between 1808 and 1862. This is the site. It also lists, just wait till it comes up. Takes a while to get 92,000 up. Here are the first 20 or so. And the striking thing about this is that it lists the African names. The vessels that were taken into courts in the 19th century, after they'd been detained in mid-Atlantic, registered the names of each individual, and of course recorded other data too, such as age, height, and in some cases origin. And what we've got here is the option, if you look at the extreme right-hand side, of playing back a recording of the name. And the reason we've done that is because most of these names were taken down in the pre-orthographic era, so there was no accepted spelling. And what we're trying to do is identify the linguistic or ethnic group to which the name belongs. And by offering a pronunciation, we hope to get responses which will allow us, in effect, to build a geographic profile, not just of the slave trade in the Atlantic, which is what the Voyager site does, but it allows us to attempt a geographic profile of the African origins of the individuals. So if you can search for a name here, or you can just double-click on any one of these records, and it will give you information on that individual. And then, and this is the key point, invite you to contribute. You have to register first to do this, but it's already working. What we're getting is responses from people who recognize the name and are able to give us a location in Africa on where the name is used. Which brings me to, I think, the major point of what I want to say. We've spent a lot of years putting these sites together. In fact, the Voyager site goes back to 1969. I'm old enough to actually have fumbled with punch cards. You've just heard about them. And we've obviously had a lot of people contributing to both sites over the years. But the key feature of both is the fact that both sites have a contribution element. So the Voyager site, it's at 35,000 voyages, but we're still getting many new contributions, which after editing are added to the site. Both sites actually refresh every so often to incorporate new information. The origin site is heavily dependent on this, but we've also had some startling new information on the Voyager site too. And this technique is called crowdsourcing. And I think it's a feature, a growing feature of all research. And quite possibly historians haven't really cottoned on to it sufficiently. I mean, there is, for example, there are sites which actually put documents up and ask help from people to transcribe the documents in terms of actually making sense of the handwriting. To move to a completely different field, there's a site called Galaxy Zoo set up at the University of Oxford, which is all about astronomy, and a professor there is inviting people to record what they see in the skies. And he's taking that data and writing research papers on it, which he shares with people that have made the contributions. There's an interaction here between the scholar and the public, which essentially is what we're trying to reproduce with these two sites. And I just think that's the future. You clearly have to edit what you get, but what you get in the end is invaluable. And I would just like to stress a couple of things which we found as a result of this kind of strategy. Voyagers was launched in 2008. Excuse me. And because we were able to pull this large number of voyages together, we made all sorts of findings, things we didn't know before. But since that's happened, we've actually got additional information which has uncovered things which I wouldn't have anticipated at all. As far as voyages are concerned, we've had major contributions in terms of the 16th and 17th century Spanish slave trades. And it now seems, we're just putting the finishing touches to an article on this, that the Spanish actually carried more slaves into their territories than the British did. And that this has, I think, significant implications for a lot of issues. On the origin side, we've got identifications now, and this is just since 2011, of 27,000 of the 92,000 individuals. Now, some of them are just single identifications, and we don't want to go with just single identifications anyway, but it's the beginning of what I think will be a research effort which will come out with this geographic profile that's possible for many areas in Africa. And already the findings, I think, are not quite what we would have expected. Let me just show you quickly. This map is made possible by a combination of both origins and voyages. What it's showing you is the distribution of the people that were taken from slave ships in the 19th century and put into the category of liberated Africans. How liberated they were is an issue of some discussion. The range was very wide. Some of them did, in fact, spend the rest of their lives in freedom. Others didn't. What you're looking at here is something like 150,000 liberated Africans, and we have, as I say, about 92,000 of them in the database, which we're using to solicit contributions. Now, here's a table showing you the kind of names we get. At the top of the table, you can see 3 examples: Boy, Okoronkwo, and Ba, from quite different parts of Africa. And underneath, there's a column for each one showing the different variations of that name which show up in the Liberated African registers and therefore on the African Origins website. In the second row, you can see the tentative identification we've made of the language and the cultural group from where the name is used. So Boy is Mende Sherbro, Okoronkwo is Igbo, and Ba is a Fula name. We can go on from that and create a profile. In this case, this is linguistic identifications in the Cameroon, and each of the circles, the green circles, indicates the region from which the individual name came, and of course the size of the group, which by implication supplied slaves into the transatlantic slave trade. This actually is taken from the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which some of you may know, which was published in late 2010. And here's the same distribution for a completely different part of West Africa, Sierra Leone. So it shows you what's possible, but this is really just the beginning, because what we're going to be doing is putting the 2 sites together and making it possible in the end, and this maybe in my next lifetime, but it's the intention at least. We're going to create a site in which it would be possible to identify an ethnic or a language group in Africa and project where that group leaves the African coast, crosses the Atlantic, and how it's distributed in the Americas. And what this amounts to is an extension of the existing Voyages website. So it's not just a question of tracking voyages, it's a question of tracking people. And of course, it can only be done for the 19th century. You can't do it before 1808, which undercuts, I guess, the reason why a lot of people are here, because the American slave trade was largely over by 1808. Finally, we're also planning to build into voyages on the other side of the Atlantic a database for the intra-American slave trade. At the present time, Voyages deals with the crossing of the Atlantic only. But there is a database already. Greg O'Malley has the basis for this, and in the course of the last few years, we've found many additional voyages. So I think this is actually perfectly feasible. The key with all this stuff is participation, getting contributions from people, and enough scholars who are prepared to devote their time in terms of editing. Thank you. Sorry, I just have to shrink this. Are you going to use this?
Yes.
Right. Right, there you go.
Great.
Sorry. Move myself.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm Fraser Neiman, and actually I'm here as part of a tag team with my colleague Jillian Galle to talk a little bit about the DAACS project, the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which is based right here at Monticello. Actually, DAACS fits very nicely into the theme that John mentioned at the outset of increasing scale that computing technology makes possible. In fact, when DAACS started, it was the Digital Archaeological Archive of Chesapeake Slavery. Initially, we concentrated on sites actually here on Mulberry Row and then spread out into the Chesapeake as well. By 2004, however, we were very interested in expanding our coverage into the Carolinas and the Caribbean. And in fact, this is just a little screenshot of the website, and I would say at lunchtime I think we're going to have a couple of our staff guys, if you guys are interested in playing with the website, over in the Woodland Pavilion. You'll be able to do that. So currently in 2013, the DAACS archive contains detailed archaeological data on 64 separate sites, some of them at least on a single sort of clusters of sites on single plantations. As you can see, we still have a sort of heavy Chesapeake focus, but we have been successful in expanding our coverage into other slave societies of North America and the Caribbean. For each site, the database itself contains archaeological site plans like this one, for example, of Building M on Mulberry Row. There's also a kind of discursive write-up provided usually by the principal investigators of the site, detailing what we know about it from documents and some historical background. And then finally, the guts of the website is a large relational database that contains very detailed data on artifacts that were recovered there. And there's a kind of easy to use, we hope easy to use, point-and-click interface that allows folks to run queries and pull down data for further analysis. I wanted to talk very briefly about the goals of the project. And, when we first started off, or at least the motivation for starting this project was my frustration with the fact that a great deal of archaeological work, not only on slavery, but especially on slavery, was very much focused on single archaeological sites. Folks would go out and dig one site, and it would be, this is my site, isn't it wonderful? And you'd kind of get a one-off view of what was found at that site. And this kind of approach made it very difficult to do the kinds of things that John was talking about, beginning to see large-scale spatial patterns and regional trends that really might begin to help us make archaeological evidence kind of compelling. So the one way around this is to try to figure out a way that we might facilitate it, systematic quantitative analysis of archaeological evidence across multiple sites and then allow us to compare among regions. But to do that, we need to, I think, build and sustain classification and measurement protocols and database schemas that would make that possible. And then having those protocols in place, share the results widely using the internet. Now, to sort of understand a little bit about the difficulties of doing that, you need to know a little bit about archaeological data. And I'm not going to get into the weeds with this, but let me, I guess it's just, I know there's some geeks in the audience, so just check that out. There's geeky stuff here. That's all you need to know. But it's important to understand that archaeological data sort of consist of three sort of kinds of things. Obviously, there are what we call archaeological contexts. These are the layers in which artifacts are found, and those, as this diagram suggests, those layers are part of a kind of nested hierarchy of entities of increasing inclusion. So layers are parts of what we call stratigraphic groups. Stratigraphic groups could be parts of features. Features are parts of structures. Structures are parts of sites, etc. So there's a complex kind of organizational hierarchy there. Secondly, there are artifacts. And artifacts also not only have properties themselves, but then, for example, ceramics have stylistic elements. So each one of those elements has properties. So there's a whole complex hierarchy of information to capture there. And then finally, and this is the guts of archaeology, one needs to keep track of relationships between archaeological contexts and the artifacts in which they were found. Archaeology is all about keeping that association and then trying to examine it at increasing levels of scale. So if we kind of put those things together, there are a couple of take-home messages here that we need to pay attention to. Obviously, the archaeological record isn't written in English, so this places a special kind of burden on us as archaeologists. It's impossible to transcribe an archaeological site, unlike an historical document. So that means that when we record information, we need to be actively making decisions about what variables are important, how we're going to code those variables, and in other words, we need classification and measurement protocols that can help us decide what to measure and how to measure it. The bad news is that archaeologists are maddeningly variable in how they go about doing this. And this results in what I like to sort of call the least common denominator, or the LCD effect, where, for example, we might imagine we have some dimension of variation, and I've just sort of shown in the little cartoon there, two archaeologists, and archaeologists 1 and 2 sort of have slightly different ways of recording that information. And if we try to compare results generated by those two individuals, we end up not with 3 classes, but with only 2. And if you kind of, imagine blowing that problem up, adding a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, pesky archaeologists with their own idiosyncratic notions about how to go about doing such things, one can imagine how the information content in the resulting data is going to quickly fall off, and you end up with nothing. So how can we get around that? Well, the DAACS solution is to work with colleagues, develop protocols that can try to address this problem, instantiate them in a structured query language database, and then use them to accumulate data from multiple sites across multiple regions and serve the data on the web. So what we end up doing in many cases for the data that are currently on the site is physically bringing collections and field records to the DAACS lab right here at Monticello, where Jillian and her team digitize them using our protocols. Our protocols are also available on the website. In addition, in some cases, we actually moved to the artifacts. So here's Jillian and her guys in Kingston, Jamaica, working up some really important collections, that pioneering work that was done by Barry Higman on Montpelier Plantation in Jamaica back in the 70s and early 80s. Currently, we have, as I say, we have we're broad regional coverage, and much of this work done is done in collaboration with a whole host of institutions in these regions. And actually, this is one of the most gratifying parts of this project, is to be able to work with colleagues widely distributed in space. And finally, obviously we do this not only because we're geeks and we love to just accumulate more and more data and share it more and more widely, but we're hoping that the result will allow us to sort of give us greater insights into specific research questions. And there's just several here that actually have structured our work and our decisions about what to record from the very beginning. You can sort of check them out here, but I'm going to, I think we're going to try to focus, or Jillian is going to focus in the rest of the presentation on the last one here, which asks us to sort of look at or consider whether or not we can track levels of variation in levels and modes and participation by enslaved people in markets, local and Atlantic markets, and the consumer revolution.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. So we were asked to also sort of demonstrate how what we do at DAACS is contributing to our both sort of archaeological and historical understanding of slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. And we've got a host of our colleagues and scholars in these different regions working on a lot of different questions. But today I want to focus on this one on enslaved consumers. And what can the material record, the archaeological record, and the data we've collected through DAACS tell us about enslaved participation in markets, in local market economies, and also in the larger consumer revolution? And how does consumption change over time and space? The archaeological data set we've developed is actually ideal in helping to answer some of those questions. We certainly know some things from primary sources about enslaved participation in the market economy. We know, for example, in the Caribbean that enslaved individuals participated in markets very early on, that markets were legal and accepted, and unlike in the colonies, the U.S. colonies, where market participation was illegal. But we know from store accounts that enslaved individuals did go, certainly by the late 18th and early 19th century, to markets, to stores, to shop, even though this was technically illegal. Archaeologically, we see great evidence for participation in consumer markets and the consumer revolution. All the artifacts you're going to see from here on out are from archaeological sites and from sites that are in the DAACS archives. So we get coins, we actively see money, as well as a host of artifact types that we know that slaves purchased from stores and from markets, from tools and tobacco pipes to fancy shoe buckles and buttons to costly imported ceramics. When it comes out of the ground, it looks like this. Often, actually, this is pretty spectacular when it comes out. These are from the Hermitage and exceptional condition. But usually we also get thousands of tiny, tiny sherds that we record and measure. But as Fraser was saying, each one of those sherds has a lot to tell us about the people who were choosing those goods and then discarding those goods. We see a lot of locally made coarse earthenwares, colonnawares. You've probably heard the term colonnaware here in the Chesapeake and the Carolinas, in the Caribbean, called yabaware, or locally produced coarse earthenware. And we have an exhibit on the coarse earthenwares over at the Woodland Pavilion that you can see at lunchtime. But there's also a host of really tremendous artifacts coming from these sites of slavery, domestic sites of slavery. And many of these pieces we are fairly certain that enslaved consumers are going and selecting in markets and purchasing and bringing back. So These artifacts on the top are from Yan and Caribou Plantation in South Carolina, a gold button and a really fabulous piece of Chinese porcelain, early Chinese porcelain. And then the sugar nippers and the jeweled buckle are from a slave village in Jamaica on the north coast. It's called Stewart Castle, a site that we've been excavating. All right, so I want to talk to you a little bit about the data and some of the trends we see in consumption over time and space, sort of the discard of these more costly artifacts that would not have been provisioned, would not have been given to the enslaved communities. For the Chesapeake, I have data from 17 phased occupations from 4 plantations. We have many more plantations from the Chesapeake in DAACS, but this is just the data set I'm working at. Okay, I'm going to show you some plots, but I'm going to try to put people behind them so you can see. This is a plot of the discard of refined earthenware and porcelain ceramics through time. Each one of these dots is a site, and behind each site is a household of people, enslaved people. Okay, so when you look at that dot, think of a household or a group of an occupation of enslaved people who are discarding these costly ceramics. So throughout, starting in 1745 through the early 19th century, there's a statistically significant increase in the discard of these expensive tablewares and teawares. And that p-value tells us that this is a statistically significant trend. Through time, there's a positive increase in the discard of these refined ceramics. The same thing's true for metal buttons, another costly item that we know enslaved individuals purchased in stores and in markets, as well as leaded glass tablewares on the right-hand side. So what's causing these very sort of fast spikes in consumption and the use and discard, the acquisition and discard of these goods? Well, we've got a couple of hypotheses. I mean, first, the cities are increasing, access to markets are increasing throughout the 18th century. But more importantly is this transition starting in the 1730s, but really sort of nearly complete by the 1790s, is this transition from tobacco cultivation, gang-based labor, to more task-based agricultural diversification, the cultivation of wheat and grains, as well as tobacco. What that allowed for the enslaved populations in the Chesapeake was sort of more flexibility in work cycles that in all likelihood contributed to mobility, the ability to earn money, to be retrained in a variety of skills that could help them earn money, that provided them with mobility to travel into cities as part of their job, as they were not at the hoe from sunup to sundown as they were with tobacco plantations. Now let's compare this to what we see in Jamaica. We're going to look at data from 30 phased occupations from 7 plantations across the island. On Jamaica, markets were legal and enslaved individuals were active participants. There's lots and lots of travelers' accounts that describe these active markets on Sundays. And provision grounds were provided for enslaved laborers on which to grow their own crops. Many of those excess crops were then sold at market. Unlike the Chesapeake, which sort of became agriculturally diversified throughout the 18th century, from the beginning, Jamaica had multiple agricultural types. There were sugar plantations, there were coffee plantations, indigo, cattle pens. And we're going to talk about how those differences, how we see those differences impacting an enslaved person's ability to participate in market activities. Here we see the trend for refined ceramic consumption on Jamaica. I want you to note that this is, you see there's not such a spike in consumption over time. It remains fairly level. But the rate is higher than in the Chesapeake. So here the Chesapeake plots on the left, the Jamaica plots on the right. You can see that in 1765 in the Chesapeake, there's very low rates of use and discard of these expensive ceramics. But in the 1760s, it's more than double the rate of discard in Jamaica. And that's, I think, indicative of the fact that you've got these vibrant markets very early on, starting in the 30s, 40s, 50s, whereas in the Chesapeake, with agricultural diversification really sort of hitting its stride by the 1780s and 1790s, you're seeing increasing numbers of enslaved individuals able to participate in markets. And then you see by sort of 1800, right, they're nearly even. Actually, in fact, Chesapeake discard of these refined ceramics has sort of edged out Jamaica by a little bit. As diversification is sort of fully underway and enslaved populations have more ability to earn money and go to markets and spend that money. And we just quickly see sort of comparisons between metal button discard in the Chesapeake versus Jamaica and glass tablewares. Now, in Jamaica, the interesting trend that reflects the diversification that we were seeing, the trend in the Chesapeake for agricultural diversification, a change in labor regime to impact the daily life of an enslaved individual and their ability to participate in market activities. We see that here in Jamaica between the coffee and the sugar plantations. So here the brown dots are coffee plantations, and this is actually a statistically significant result that enslaved individuals on coffee plantations were more likely to have the ability to discard much higher quantities of costly ceramics and metal buttons in this case than were enslaved individuals living on sugar plantations, which were much more of a task-based, a sort of a gang labor-based system versus the coffee, which was more similar to a wheat task-based system. So that's it. We're happy to talk more about our results, but when we look at these dots, I really always think about the people who are discarding these goods and sort of what are the variables that are impacting these long-term trends that we can see archaeologically that we might not see through the historic record. So thank you.
So when we think about the chronological extent of the emergence and flourishing of slavery in the New World, we're accustomed to talking about centuries and decades. And when we talk about the obliteration of slavery in the United States, it happened in 5 years. And so because of this discrepancy in the chronological scope of these two processes, it's very easy to begin thinking about the geographic differentiation of slavery. So when we talk about what was slavery or how did slavery work, the question that immediately comes to our minds is, well, what do you mean? Where? Where are you talking about? When? These are immediate follow-ups, and you cannot answer the question, what was slavery like, without those. Well, we're not quite as used to thinking about emancipation in the same way because it happened so fast, and could be one explanation. We're even debating whether it's worth asking that question at all, because perhaps slavery vanished with the stroke of a pen, some scholars have said. Well, Visualizing Emancipation is a project that attempts to provoke us to think about emancipation in a geographically nuanced way. To begin thinking about the process as very different in some places than in others, to think about it perhaps even as a system itself with interdependent parts that you can't know just by reading the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment. So Visualizing Emancipation then is a new map that hopes to get at some of these questions. I'm Scott Nesbit at the University of Richmond, and I've been working we started thinking about this project in 2010 and started working in earnest on it late that year. And I was working on it with Ed Ayers, the president at the University of Richmond, my colleagues at the Digital Scholarship Lab, and we were working with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Office of Digital Humanities. And we had a large number of students working with us on this project. Now, in order to map the end of slavery, we needed sources. And I'd like to talk about a few of those. The main source for Civil War historians are the official records of the War of the Rebellion. This is a fantastic resource that's been digitized, actually, I think, by 3 different universities with varying levels of completeness and of specificity in terms of the transcriptions of these documents. But maybe a history of these documents would be in order, a brief history. So during the official records of the War of the Rebellion is, at the end of the day, just some letters written between officers in the Union armies, Confederate armies, and the navies, especially the Union Navy. It's 130,000 pages or so of these letters, and they look like what you see here. This one's written from W.W. McCall, the Chief of Staff in the headquarters of the Army of Tennessee, and he's in the field writing to Colonel Wright. And he's talking about how General Johnston of the Confederacy wishes you to put the engineers and the Negro laborers engaged on the fortifications of Atlanta under the orders of General Wayne or the general commanding the Georgia state troops to prepare the defenses on the Chattahoochee. So this is just one little scrap of many, many documents. So this is the source base that we decided to work with most intensely. And we did so in 2 different ways. We believed that in order to map the end of slavery, we would need to find out both where armies went and what African Americans were doing in the American South. So in this map, the blue dots that you can see indicate places where Union Army regiments went during the war. There are 45,000 or so of these little dots. And while we don't claim that we have every spot, certainly, this is a great number of them. We also gathered what we were calling emancipation events, and I'll get to those in a second. But first, these Union Army regiment movements. There are a couple ways, well, there's really one way that we got these, and that's through this guy. This is Frederick Dyer. He was a drummer boy in the 9th Connecticut Infantry during the Civil War. He was actually too young to serve, but he snuck off anyway and was able to serve, and he actually survived the war, which was a miracle in and of itself. And as the official records were being compiled at the end of the war and for the next actually 30 years by the War Department, when they were finally published in the 1880s and 90s, this former drummer boy decided that what was really needed was a comprehensive index of where all of these armies went, all of the Union armies went. And so he locked himself in his study in Iowa, and 5 years later emerged with a description of where every single of the 3,500 or so regiments went on every day during the war. So these are all the movements. So he wrote these down and published them as, he self-published this account as Dyer's Compendium of the War of the Rebellion in 1908. Fast forward 100 years or so, and this book was scanned by the Perseus Project at Tufts University. And they scanned it and transcribed it. Actually, they used some OCR and transcription combined. And then they applied some algorithms to this work to transform, let's say, the first 2 lines of this account. This is all one regiment. This is an Alabama regiment cavalry regiment, I believe, that went all over the place. And they transformed the first two lines of that into something that looked like this. You see the word service in the head tags, and here we get in very quickly into some technical things. But so they're part of Sherman's expedition to Port Royal, South Carolina. You can see, so Sherman's expedition to, where do we have Port Royal, South Carolina? Right there, yeah. Okay, so in other words, they added a lot of computer-readable text to this human-readable text. And we took this document, which is still just a text, and ran some algorithms on it to come up with, instead of a text, a map. The other, and that produced these 40,000 or so points. The other way that we worked during this project was to try to find what enslaved people were doing in the American South. And so we looked at a few different sources. One is these same official records, this time not in the digitized form that the Perseus Project used or that Frederick Dyer created, but in just the digitized texts. And we looked through those for any mention of African Americans. And my students started looking and started asking, and it was a process in which I did not give them a vocabulary, but we started talking, well, when you see these mentions of African Americans, what is happening? What are people doing in the American South? And where are they doing it? So they wrote down some data every time they saw an instance of an African American mentioned in these official records, these 130,000 or so pages of documents. And we encoded these with perhaps not according to the tried and true rigorous standards that you would find in archaeological digs, but ones that evolved out of interacting with the documents and making very subjective judgments about what in fact was going on with emancipation. And we came up at first with 200 or so categories of things that happened, and we eventually whittled those down to about 10 different kinds of events that we saw. And these were distributed, unsurprisingly, unevenly in the American South. They were, which is not really a surprise. We know that emancipation didn't play out the same way everywhere. But having this data will allow us to answer a couple questions that we frankly haven't been able to ask or answer before. What actually was the relationship?
Are each of the troop movements designated by different colors, or how do you tell which troop is which?
So right now, in this website, you cannot actually click on any of the troops. I'm happy to share the data with you, and it's not publicly available yet, but I'm happy to share it. So you can't tell which unit is where from looking at the website, but we actually have that data to show you where every individual regiment went. For the people, in terms of the actions of enslaved people, sometimes we have names associated with these instances. In many cases, we don't have names or anything like that because it says something like the Negro laborers, right? And so there's no way even to tell how many people they're talking about. So there's no, while there is kind of a textual description of how many people are involved, that is sometimes sometimes all of them, sometimes 200. But we haven't represented that in the map in any systematic way because we didn't want to represent some. But what this is going to help us do is ask a few different questions, like what actually is the relationship between the armies and enslaved people? How close did the armies have to get before people said, you know what, this is a good chance for me to escape slavery? We don't know really the answer to these questions, and we don't know how these questions differed depending on where you were. And we don't really know either how the end of slavery differed from place to place, except in any but the most general sense. And this will help us get a little bit closer to figuring out those questions.
Thank you to all the presenters. This is truly a fascinating modern age that we live in. There's already hands going up, which is always a good sign. So feel free to ask away.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Nesbit. About 4 minutes ago, you mentioned, I think you mentioned that. It's on. Thank you. I believe you mentioned that there were, for the red dots, you mentioned that there were 10 events that you all had narrowed down what the red dots meant. Would you please give us an example of some of those events were? Thank you.
Sure. So we didn't think, at first we thought it would be very cut and dried when people were becoming free, when people were enslaved and when they were not. But that became very difficult when we got down into the documents to tell what was happening. So, for example, we have some events that are encoded as fugitive slaves or runaways. Many of these events are taken from runaway slave ads that were found in the newspapers of the South. We've looked very closely at a couple newspapers, and actually we're working with schools across the South right now to develop this database in a kind of crowdsourcing, like the way that Professor Eltis has spoken about. We also have things like African Americans abused, right? So violence against people of color was absolutely part of the process of emancipation and the underside of it. We're only now getting a handle on just how many people, most of them women and children, died through exposure, through violence against them, through sickness during this very chaotic process. So other events are, for example, people being re-enslaved by Confederates, people who are being forced to work by the Union Army, and others in which people are coming voluntarily with information or other things to the Union. So, and by the way, the website is dsl.richmond.edu. I'll be giving a presentation on it later.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Quick question for the archaeologists, as contrasted with Professors Eltis and Nesbit. Both of them used crowdsourcing as a term, and obviously the projects involved that. The two of you did not, and one could easily think of some reasons why you probably wouldn't. But my question is, is there any analogy between crowdsourcing and any part of what you're doing? Or is it prohibited by the parameters of the endeavor?
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. One of the as I said, one of the downsides is if you want to be able to see these large scale trends, you really need to be able to classify and measure things the same way. One of the so currently this is kind of a constraint on our design. In fact, Jillian and her staff do a lot of digitize things. Most of the data in DAACS comes from the activities of Jillian and her staff here. We currently have three what we call satellite labs. These are labs that run our software and where we have trained members of those organizations to implement our protocols and collect data, so that it plays well with all of our data. And those are Drayton Hall in South Carolina, the Washington and Lee, Dr. Allison Bell, who teaches archaeology there, and also Mount Vernon. We currently have a plot afoot to partner with PhD programs at the six sort of major PhD programs that do archaeology of slave societies, and this is, we hope, going to allow us to essentially put the database in the cloud. These people will be able to access it using web browser and begin to enter their own data. But along with that will come a series of annual workshops and training programs to get folks up to speed, so that everybody again is we're empowering folks to generate data that plays well with other data. So I mean, this kind of goes back to the what I said at the beginning. The archaeological record isn't written in English, right? It's not written in a natural language. So there really there's a kind of technical bar that needs to be leapt in order to, as the price of entry, to be able to generate information that's going to be analytically useful. And that I think that prevents us from taking advantage of the kind of crowdsourcing that historians may be able to do. But certainly we want to move in that direction, right? Figure out how to get more people involved, and we're trying to do that.
Professor Miller?
Thank you very much, Scott. At first I thought terrific, emancipation, and then you began to talk about the details of the information that you were generating. And I'm wondering what the connection is between emancipation, which was a stroke of a pen on a date, and your records, many of which obviously precede that Emancipation Proclamation, which may or may not have applied in a part of the North America that was not jurisdictionally part of the United States at that time. And so I'm wondering what the legalities of this are. What you're really looking at are any notes of enslaved people in contact with the Union Army. Was the Union Army systematically, did they have a policy with regard to the slaves that joined them or with whom they came into contact? Could you expand on that, please?
Sure. So I usually try to take care to say that the project is called Visualizing Emancipation, but what it's mapping is the end of slavery. So these are two different things. I would say that there were policies that changed over the course of the war. So if you were in, let's say, Missouri in the fall of 1861, if you were captured by one commander, then he would tell your slave owner to get lost when he came to look for you. And if you were captured by another, he would say, oh yes, that guy, he's right over here. And so the person would be re-enslaved. Or maybe was never free at all, right? So first of all, there's the question of the policies, which differed both in their geographic scope. The Emancipation Proclamation, for example, specified the places where it applied. It did not apply to Tennessee. It did not apply to the eastern shore of Virginia or much of Hampton Roads or Alexandria or Arlington. It did not apply to southern Louisiana, the area around New Orleans. So there are a number of ways, and we trace out also the kind of ways that the statutes delimit where they apply. But what we're really looking for are the actions that African Americans are taking during this process and the ways in which those lead sometimes to further enslavement, but sometimes not. And it's almost impossible to tell which is which based on the immediate circumstances in which people find themselves. So that's why we don't have a differing color, for example, of dots that, oh, these are the people who are free and these are the people who are not free, because the whole process was so fluid. Yes, so we have documents from Oklahoma. Oklahoma was the only area within which now, what we consider now to be the United States. Oklahoma was the only space in which slavery lasted longer than 1865. It was not abolished until 1866 there, and it was done so through treaties with the autonomous American Indian tribes. So so they remain a slave territory on our map past when our map ends. They were not affected by the 13th Amendment.
This ma'am, lady in the blue sweater, and then you, sir.
This is for all of you. How is your statistical count going in the north, where people don't know there was slavery for many, many years? And I know you concentrated on the Civil War era right now, but earlier, slavery existed. The factory in City was a huge slavery area. Do you have any statistical information about that, or language and identifying tribal groups that particularly went from the north as opposed to the south?
I can chime in for the archaeologists. So for the last 10 years, we've really been focusing on the Chesapeake, the Carolinas, and the Caribbean, precisely so we could develop a rich data set that would allow us to make these comparisons between different plantation types and regions from which, so very different demographic questions for these three regions. But with our current plot to take over these other graduate programs, where a number of the institutions we're partnering with are in the north, and one in particular, Boston University. Mary Beaudry has a number of graduate students who are working on sites of slavery in Massachusetts. We're also partnering with Syracuse University. They have a number of graduate students who are working on sites on Long Island. So we anticipate that in the near future we'll begin to get sites of slavery from New England, archaeological sites of slavery from New England into DAACS. So.
Well, I was just going to say the other. There's a huge. It's one of the big frontiers, I think, in the study of slavery is the study of slavery in the northern colonies, but particularly this is one area where I think Greg O'Malley's work on the intercolonial slave trade is so important, and that in many cases, the New England colonies or the Connecticut River Valley doesn't have, a very clear tie to the transatlantic slave trade, but better documenting connections between colonies in the north and the intercolonial slave trade with the West Indies will help to begin to clarify those questions, although, David, you could probably say more about that than I can.
Yes, I don't think it'll change the overall picture, but clearly it will add a lot of detail. And a surprising number of slave vessels actually ended up in the north from Africa, largely because they were returning from the West Indies, where they sold most of the people they had on board. But they kept several which they didn't sell, and these people, of course, ended up in the north, sold as servants. But none of this changes that basic imbalance between north and south, obviously.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
The first question I had was, has there been any incorporation of genetic research into the slave trade, the emancipation, this type of information that should be available?
We are, we don't deal with genetic data. I mean, I am aware that, with the genomic revolution, continues to, revolutionize our understanding of, large-scale demographic, movements of people, and beginning with or actually predating the movement of modern humans out of Africa. We're at least in the genetic literature, we're beginning to get hints of I think equally compelling results about origins of individuals, in Africa. I think at the moment, much of that literature, most of the stuff that's been published in that literature deals with mitochondrial and Y chromosome haplotypic variation, which doesn't have the geographical precision that historians might like. I think that with, as the cost of full genome assays continues to plummet, that we can expect within a decade to really be able, or perhaps one can expect that geneticists will, within a decade, be able to really tell us something useful about pretty fine-grained origins of individuals in Africa and variability in where folks end up that would mesh nicely with Professor Eltis's work on the slave trade, variability on where folks end up here in the New World.
David?
If I can just add to that, excuse me, the basic problem is that I don't think there's a big enough pool of data on the African side of the Atlantic yet to go very far into this. I think it's still several years down the road. I find increasingly I get geneticists and scientists coming to me asking for information from the slave trade, and really what I want to do is ask them about how they can help me. So I think we're still several years away from that. And moreover, where the data exist, it tends to be in places which didn't supply too many captives. It's in places like South Africa or East Africa. That's the basic problem which I think needs addressing.
Yes, sir.
It's a question for David Eltis. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on your comments about the Spanish slave trade. I want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Well, I can give you the draft of an article which we just finished the last few days. Would probably solve it. Yes, the basic point I think is that my comment is based not just on the transatlantic traffic, but on the intercolonial traffic. And that, as everyone, of course, recognizes, is not as easily plotted. But it is possible to reconstruct flows from particularly the British colonies into Spanish America. And that's what we've attempted to do. Right now, the two numbers look sort of equivalent, but I'm pretty sure that more material is going to come out which puts the Spanish ahead.
Yes, ma'am.
Microphone?
The others.
I've been struggling at a very small historic site without a lot of resources to start building my own data sets from a huge amount of information that I have. Do you have any recommendations for software that we can use that not necessarily doesn't cost much, but is better than Microsoft Word and Excel to start this process?
Well, I mean, I know, David, it's the transatlantic slave trade database. I don't know what it functions off of on the web, but it's SPSS. That's the files are downloadable. I've always found, maybe it's just because I was trained in that in graduate school, but I've always found it a lot more intuitive and easier to use. I still don't know how to use Excel. And
What does SPSS stand for?
software package for the social sciences.
Oh, statistical package.
Is it statistical?
Package for the
Sorry, I just know it as SPSS, but it's the downloadable files that you can download from the transatlantic slave trade database are in SPSS.
Also, they're in CSV as well. But yeah, I mean, SPSS has great diagnostic power. You can do all sorts of things with it, which you can't do with Excel. And we actually, for down to 2008, just before we launched the first version of the Voyages database, that's where the data lived in SPSS. Since then, the data lives on the web. All the changes we've made are actually on the web, and that's an SQL, which isn't really available for laptops. So, yeah, I mean, there are other packages which are just as good. Usually you wander into these packages because somebody recommends them and you learn how to use them, and you just don't want to take the time to find out something else because you've got other things you want to do.
There was another question back there.
I was just going to add to that. I think the issue of proprietary software and cost is a big one, and it's one that I think is increasingly being addressed out there. Currently DAACS, for example, somewhat unfortunately, because of its age, runs under Microsoft SQL Server, a proprietary SQL relational database. But you can download MySQL and it'll run on your Windows box, and it's free. If you're interested in serious data analysis, the thing that is going to put, well, SPSS now belongs to IBM, so they're not going out of business anytime soon. But the realm of data analysis is quickly, folks who do this seriously are quickly turning to a free package called R. If you just Google R, the letter R, and actually, because there's currently, if you're interested in learning how to use it, there's currently a guy at Hopkins named Jeff Leake who's doing a free Coursera course on it. It's a wonderful thing. That
to actually use SPSS, you need to be part of an institution. To actually go cold on the site and buy it is pretty well out of the question.
I would chime in and say you could start with Microsoft Access here. That for people who really are, if you're coming from Word and Excel, simply getting to know how to build a relational database, how your data, how your documents relate to each other, what sort of information do you want to get out, how you want to get it out, and then learning how to build your database in something as easy as Microsoft Access is the way to go. And then you can go and you can start programming in R and SPSS and you can make those transitions easily. But for people who are really just getting into this, thinking I'd like to digitize my data, but more importantly I'd like to get information out of my data. I'd like to pull data out, get them into tables, link those tables so I can query across. I'd recommend getting a couple of good books on relational databases, taking a class in it, and then going from there.
And then keeping spare copies of your data in a format that's like a text file, that is a CSV file that so that you won't lose it once Microsoft pulls the plug on Access.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question in the back.
I'm not sure if this is a question or it's just going to be sort of a sort of statement. And my name is Patricia Moncure Thomas. And there's a church up in Fredericksburg called Aquia. And that's my 6-time great-grandfather, white grandfather, that's buried under the chancel of that church. My comment or my question for you is that there are many people like me who have had a discovery of who they are, but a story came through the white man who had all those children by that black woman. I can't find where the black woman comes from, but I do know that the Moncure name. I do know I had my dad's DNA done. He connects right to the Moncures. He goes right to Scotland. Not being able to get him back to Africa is a real source of pain. But I know that George Mason is my uncle. I know that George Washington is a cousin. He and George Mason and George Washington married sisters. They married, Frances Brown was my grandmother, who was married to the Reverend John Moncure. I have a lot of information that I can document about that white side of the family, which was a secret kind of that was told along the way that you really didn't talk a lot about. But it's when you get to the real thing and try to get to who you are on that black side, and you can't get any of your relatives back into Africa. I know things are growing, but maybe there's stuff out there that you guys know more about than I know that would say that, it's equally important, that I know where my great-grandmother, whose name was Charlotte Shakespeare. And there were some Shakespeares here, some white ones, so I don't know. I know she came out of South Carolina, that area. I know that my great-grandmother on my mom's side were Elstons, but I still don't know where my black relatives came from. So that's the pain, And I'm a geek too about digital stuff, and I've written my own book because no one told me about who my family was. But I think, I just want to make this statement, because I thought maybe just telling you from the point of view of somebody who's been out there and loves this work. And I am a geek. I love digits, but I can't find all the digits. I can't find all of the things that say who I am. But for that's just my statement, my kind of sort of question, all enrolled in one. But it's just to say that some of us are real, and the databases are great, but then there are the real realities of who we are.
David?
Yeah, the slave trade clearly is a huge barrier amongst many other things, and going back to Africa because people were renamed essentially. However, if you can actually trace your origins to a slave, there are plantation records that have names which are clearly African. It's not a large percentage, but if you do get to that point, then you can at least have a chance of picking out the probable region in Africa that person or that person's ancestors came from. It's probably possible for maybe less than 10% of all slave plantation records, but I've seen people do it. That's about the best I can offer you. I mean, there are certain clear patterns, like day names for various groups in West Africa, and we've got to the point now where we can actually separate the groups off by the way the day name is actually pronounced, even though it's at root the same name across different groups. But it's a sliver of hope. I'm afraid we can't go beyond that because of the nature of the slave trade and what it did to people in effect.
The only thing I would add to that, I mean, one of the things all of these, I think, presentations share in common is how automation, computers, and the internet are allowing larger and larger scales of analysis, right, to kind of identify patterns that more closely focused scholarship wouldn't enable to do in the past. But a side part of that is increasing accessibility of information, right? So in terms of, within Virginia, the Virginia Historical Society has launched this initiative that allows people to access their records by searching for names, and it's largely based off of the collections that they have at the Historical Society. And I think ultimately a goal would be to integrate the kind of work that I've done into a data set like that. And I would echo what David's saying, that, I mean, in many cases, I mean, you're never going to get, to the individual person, but I think you can get, given everything we're able to do in terms of unearthing these records, organizing them, increasing accessibility, you can at least begin to get into the neighborhood far more so than you could before. And that's really exciting. I mean, and I think it also, the possibilities of that open up new research questions, which, I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to suggest at the end, that the accumulation of tons of data, it's not just about seeing large patterns, but also really important historical phenomenon like miscegenation. I mean, it's something that in many cases in the records, well, I know in the case of Virginia, the records are pretty good about tracing interracial sexual pairing where the participants are a black man and a white woman. But after 1663, participants who are a white man and a black woman disappear from the record. And trying to find out a way to use the evidence that is available to get at least some idea of the scale of this type of interaction, or the percentage of ethnic diversity within the enslaved population at any given point in time. I think these are brand new questions that, because of the ability to organize data on this level, you're now able to ask. Yes, ma'am.
I personally feel the pain of the person who just made a last comment. However, and I'm a public historian, and I'm very blunt in the way I speak, so you'll find out tomorrow. This is great, and I love what scholars do, but my job is to tell the lay people what you're doing, because it's great when you're in ivory towers doing the work, but it needs to get out. So to speak to the pain that she was just speaking of, if we can get Dr. David's work out to the public, the more people know, the more people can contribute to the database, because you don't know who's out there, who's heard things over generations, what have you. And I did not know about this AfricanOrigins.org, which I'm going to go back into the community and let people know. But in today's society, which I hate social media, but you can put things out like that on social media, and it will go off like wildfire. Just a comment.
Well, just one caveat, though. The problem is the African Origins site is really aimed at the first generation African diaspora, in a sense. I don't want to give misleading expectations. A lot of African Americans go to it excitedly and come away disappointed, because you need to have a good knowledge of an African cultural group in order to identify with any precision the names that we're offering. I think the payoff is going to be down the road when we're able to assemble the information we get. But our target group is really either in Africa or among the people that have come to the Americas. And remember, there's more Africans come to the U.S. since 1992 than during the whole period of the slave trade. So there's a very substantial potential pool of knowledge out there, and moreover, Africa itself is there's been huge strides in internet availability in the last 10 years, 5 years especially.
There's a question back here, I believe, somewhere. Oh, yes, ma'am.
For all of you, hello, as practitioners of the creators of these digital projects that involve all of these behind-the-scenes decisions that you have to make about how to classify things, for the archaeologists, how to measure, how to set up the protocols, decisions that you all as the scholars have to impose sort of between the raw materials and the data outputs and creations. How much do you feel, and I haven't explored all of your sites, so maybe it's there, that you need to have some place on the site for the curious to go and understand some of those decisions that you've made that shape what's being seen on the front end? Is that something that you feel like you have to put out there for people? Do people care? Does the public care? Your visitors to your sites? I'm curious, as a creator of a digital site myself, how much of that to make apparent.
Yeah, so I'll jump right in and say that in creating the DAACS database and the archive, we started with a steering committee of 30 archaeologists and historians who work on slavery. So from the very beginning, the protocols for recording the data we record were determined by a large group, just not by me and Fraser and our staff. But we have a whole section of our website called About the Database, and About DAACS. And within those sections, we publish we publish the database structure. We publish all of the authority terms we use for every single table. We publish our cataloging manuals. We publish our stylistic element guides for ceramics. And these get a lot of traffic. So when I look at the user stats and people are coming to see how do we record our data. For us, it's very important that we are transparent about the decisions that we made, about the data we record and the decisions we made when we decided to record those data.
And I guess likewise for voyages that we get, but there's one thing I'd just like to add to what you've said, which is that we get a Google Analytics report every month on usage, and Voyages currently gets about 1,000, during term time anyway, gets 1,000 visits a day. It's fairly well used. But when you break down the stats, there's a very small percentage of those actually go into the essays and the careful definitions because the analytics breaks down into which pages were viewed, and it's slightly disappointing to see that all the effort we've put into the section understanding the database is, well, I guess this is, I'm just griping, that's all.
I have a question for two different people. For Professor Eltis, my question is, when you're doing the intra-colonial or the intra-America database, is that only voyages by ship?
Yes.
Okay, because, I mean, weren't there over 1 million people who were traded internally?
Yes.
Okay, just checking. And for the archaeologist,
yeah.
I noticed a big gap in your collection. There's South Carolina, there's Tennessee, there's Virginia, but there's something in between where I happen to live. And I know there's Somerset, there's Tryon Palace, there's Stagville with, you know, enormous numbers of people. Why are we missing?
Politics. Actually, North Carolina was in our sort of 2004 grant for the Mellon Foundation, and we've been able. Yeah, I think we were going to do Eden House was slated to be digitized. The collections were split between 3 different institutions in the state, and we sort of had agreements with the 3, and then the 3 decided that they couldn't cooperate, couldn't get the artifacts to us up here. So that's been, I think, our only time we've been unable to get a collection to Monticello. So it's not that we won't go back to North Carolina. I think our, our research interests have, and sort of the interest of our colleagues have really sort of remained in the 3, main, so the Caribbean, South Carolina, and sort of Maryland, Virginia at this point. But if you've got some sites for us, please come talk to me about it.
Yeah. Actually, I think the good news for North Carolina is one of our collaborators in the future plot that I referred to is Dr. Anna Agby-Davies, who's at UNC. And so we hope that through her students will begin to plug that hole.
Yeah.
I was just thinking it because we are anomalous.
Right. Yeah.
It would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nope. A couple of questions. Get there. Then we'll come back to you, ma'am.
So earlier you were talking about folks trying to trace their personal origins through slave history, and you didn't recommend the African Origins website.
Sorry,
what do you recommend, especially for non-academics? Can you not hear me?
No.
I'm so sorry. All right. You're talking about personal African Americans, especially non-academics, tracing their own origins from out of Africa. You didn't recommend AfricanOrigins.org. What do you recommend?
There's nothing equivalent that I can think of in terms of a convenient site. Maybe something will come to me, but I'm sort of drawing a blank on that. Perhaps somebody in the audience can.
There's a website called Low Country Africana, but it's mostly focused with South Carolina, and they are building a very large database using a lot of information. So it's a pretty good starting point for people who know that they have some origins in South Carolina. Low Country Africana. And it is a great starting point for people who know that they have roots in South Carolina. So that might be a starting point. And the person who runs the website, her name is Toni Carrier, and she loves a mystery. You can email her and give her a name, and she will be on that name, and she won't give up. So she sees it as a personal mission to help anybody who emails her. So you might give her a try if you have any history in South Carolina.
Ma'am, if you can pass that microphone to the lady just behind you. This will have to be the last question of the session.
Thank you. Well, minor question,
all
maybe.
All good things must
not.
come to an end.
This is really a question for Scott, I think, but maybe also you, John. You mentioned that you couldn't specify people in the emancipation, that many of times it's general, 200 laborers, etc. But sometimes there are specifics, and I'm wondering if you're also collecting those specific names, and then whether there's any way to connect those back to people that we know were enslaved, and whether there's any interconnections between some of these databases.
Yes, we are collecting names. So we have many of the events that we have African American name and slave owner name as kind of two of the fields that we were actively collecting data for. Most often these would be one name, right? So we have a lot of slave advertisements, looking for Jack. But sometimes because these slave ads are maybe the best source for this kind of thing, because they'll have usually a slave owner with two names, or sometimes a middle name as well, in a particular place, looking for an enslaved person, right? And a lot of times they give suggestions on where this person went when they were running away, and often it wasn't just to the Yankees. It wasn't. So, for example, there's this one fellow who ran away outside of Stanton. Union Army came down, General Hunter's crew. He didn't run away with General Hunter, but instead took off, just 2 weeks later, took off towards Petersburg, where he was from originally, because he'd been transported there through the internal slave trade in Virginia to Westview in Augusta County. His name is Jack, and he gives a description of the young man so that he could be more easily apprehended. And so this kind of information, I would think, would be difficult to link up with other databases, but there are new technologies that are allowing for that kind of work. The most promising of these would be linked data, which Tim Berners-Lee and other people who are thinking very deeply about the structure of the internet as a whole have been thinking about these kinds of issues and how to link data between multiple databases in an open framework.
Joe.
Yeah, I know you want to close down. So
Yes.
Very brief, but now that we're into names and individuals, there is a project that you may not know about at Michigan State University, which is compiling a range of these kinds of. There's a project at Michigan State University headed by Walter Hawthorne and Gwen Hall, which is compiling all the databases that they can find out about in some kind of a cross-searchable integrated database. And so if you have any data at all, they would love to hear from you. They have already tens of thousands of names, and they extend into the Caribbean as well as in parts of the South. But this is an NEH-supported, I think, next generation kind of pan-integration of all of these data sets by names.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Thanks again to...
Now I want to discuss the important business of lunch. Lunch will be available outside. It is complimentary. Pick up a box lunch. You may dine here in the theater, or you may dine in the 2 educational classrooms located on the lower level. You can walk down the steps to them, or you can go through the ticket office to find them. You may also take your lunch to the Woodland Pavilion, where I encourage you to make brief but significant visit there to see 6 demonstrations. You will have the treat of seeing Scott Nesbit and Visualizing Emancipation, Jillian Galle and DAACS, the Virginia Historical Society Unknown No Longer, the Central Virginia History Researchers, African American Families Database, Monticello's Getting Word Project will be shown, and last, the animation developed for Mulberry Row, a digital reconstruction of the Mulberry Row site. So please stop there, and we will have 1 hour. So it will be a bit of a race, 12 to 1. We're going to try and keep the digital displays open in the Woodland Pavilion later. So you have a lot of things to do, and enjoy it all. Thank you.